You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 199. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. How often do you put something off thinking that your future self can deal with it? If you've ever done this, you are 100% not alone. And I'm excited to have you here this week because we are going to dive into 3 myths about procrastination and your future self. Thank you for joining. I'm so excited to have you here. This is going to be a fun episode, and it was inspired by something that happened to me just the other day. So we are at the beginning of March, at least when I'm recording this episode, it's the first week of March. And on Monday, I sat down to do my February invoices. Maybe you do the same thing. And when it came to doing those invoices, I thought, this is the last thing I feel like doing right now. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon. I had spent the morning preparing for a webinar that I'm giving on later this week for International Women's Day, which I'm really excited about. But I'd just gone through all my slides, I'd reviewed my materials, and so mentally I was not exhausted, but I'd certainly exerted myself. I'd had a coaching call, so I'd worked with a client. I had done some other admin tasks already. I'd prepped for another webinar that I delivered earlier this week. And so I just felt tired. I did not want to do my invoices. So I thought to myself, I don't have to do them today, right? Nobody's waiting for these. And if they show up tomorrow, it's not going to make a difference to anybody but me. Maybe I'll do them tomorrow afternoon instead. But when I thought about the tomorrow afternoon, I thought, okay, well, I will have just finished delivering a different webinar, and chances are I'm not going to feel any more energetic. I'm not going to want to do them. And so I made the choice to do the invoices. I decided to sit down with them, and I managed to get through all of them in that sitting, even though I didn't want to. And it made me think about how often we procrastinate. And procrastination is one of those things where I know I have done my fair share of procrastination, and I continue to procrastinate. I'm not perfect, but I know I'm a lot better at managing it now because of the tools that I have as a coach where I can spot the procrastination and do something about it. And it's an area where I've helped a lot of lawyers because you have areas where you are procrastinating, and it can help to understand what's going on here and have some tools to deal with it, to deal with those moments where you don't feel like doing a certain task. So we're going to take a fun approach to procrastination today, and we're going to explore 3 myths about your future self and procrastination. And my goal is that by the end of today's podcast episode, you'll have a new way of thinking about procrastination, of thinking about your future self, as well as some practical tools, some practical strategies to help you take action next time you're tempted to push something off. So we're going to start with a couple of definitions. First, I just wanted to define procrastination. Now, you know what procrastination is. You likely have your own definition of procrastination. I'll give you a couple. One of them comes from the Cambridge Online Dictionary, and it is to keep delaying something that must be done, often because it is unpleasant or boring. I love this definition because it incorporates the words unpleasant or boring. We do not procrastinate typically when it comes to things that are fun or exciting that we really want to do. There's another definition that I really like that comes from Wikipedia. Procrastination is the act of unnecessarily delaying or postponing something despite knowing that there could be negative consequences for doing so. So I love this definition because it highlights that procrastination is unnecessary, which is kind of neat, right? This idea that you actually don't need to put this thing off. And I also like that it talks about the negative consequences that might follow in the future from putting something off today. So as we explore this idea of procrastination, think about where it is in your practice or maybe in your personal life where you procrastinate the most. We all have our go-to procrastination areas, and so there's no shame in this, but think about where that might be. So for a number of lawyers, that can be time entries. I continue to have conversations with lawyers who procrastinate when it comes to recording your time. So that might be an area for you where you tend to procrastinate. Career moves are a big area of procrastination, right? It's that idea of being in a job where you don't love it, you don't really see a future, but you put off making a decision about whether to go or stay. Difficult conversations, really great to put those off into the future. Sometimes it's a task, right? Something that has a high degree of complexity, or it seems like it's a really big task. It feels overwhelming. And so you push it off into the future. Those are areas where you might procrastinate at work. Now, when it comes to your home life or your personal life, some areas where you might procrastinate, bedtime, right? Who doesn't sometimes fall into the trap of knowing that you should go to bed at a certain time, but then you get distracted, right? You have a conversation with somebody in your household, or you're on the phone with someone, you're watching a really great show and you just want to watch the end. You pull out your phone and you start scrolling. Next thing you know, you've lost 30 minutes, an hour, your bedtime is going way past your intended bedtime. And so you've procrastinated the act of actually going to sleep. Maybe it's tidying or decluttering projects or projects that feel overwhelming. So this happened to us actually very recently. We've had the worst microwave forever. I think our microwave, I shouldn't say that our microwave isn't the worst, but we broke the door handle on that microwave years ago. And ever since, this has been years, to open the microwave, we had to kind of pull at the corner of the microwave. It was really awkward, especially if your hands were wet and it was all slippery. But it just wasn't urgent. It wasn't important. And so we let this go and we procrastinated on the microwave forever until just the other day when the microwave decided that it would stop working. And so that was great because it forced us out of our procrastination. We now have a lovely, lovely microwave that doesn't even have a handle, right? We just pull it open. So we can't even break this handle. But that's what it took in order for us to take action on that one. So we've talked a little bit about procrastination, what it means, some examples of it. The other definition, which is more of just a concept, is this idea of your future self. So your future self, as far as this podcast episode is concerned, is really just you at some point in the future. This could be you after listening to this episode. This could be you tomorrow. This could be you in 2 weeks, 2 years, 2 decades. The idea here is that we're thinking about who you are at some point in the future. And we're going to use that as we explore the 3 myths that we have when it comes to you in the future and procrastination. So diving in, starting now, myth number 1, your future self is a woo-woo concept and we don't need to consider her. Yes, you will not be surprised to learn, I like the woo-woo. I like the idea of future self. I like to do future self meditations. I like to channel my future self when it comes to making decisions. I like to think about what my future self is like. And I've led meditations on this topic. I love to help my clients explore what they want in their futures, whether or not they look at it through the lens of a future self or not. So future self is something where you might hear it and think, okay, Paula, that is so woo-woo. I don't know where you're going with this. Why are we even talking about the future self? This is supposed to be serious. We're talking about procrastination and work. But hear me out here. As humans, we grapple with the future, right? It is this concept that is ahead of us and it is inherently uncertain. A couple examples. I live in Vancouver, as you very likely know, and in the past 2 or 3 weeks, we've had 2 earthquakes. They have not been big earthquakes, but they are unsettling, right? I've felt the earth move. And when we had the first earthquake, my phone went off. There's this alert about, go find a place to shelter yourself. And I didn't know if that earthquake meant that we were going to have multiple earthquakes to follow. There was this feeling of uncertainty, right? And your future in many beautiful ways is uncertain, right? You don't know what amazing opportunities are coming your way, nor do you know what challenges are coming your way. So as humans, we tend to favor and value the present moment over the future because the future is an abstract concept, right? We can't really see it. We can't really feel it. And so we tend to prioritize the here and now. And you've probably heard the expression, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? That goes to the concept of the idea that what you have currently, what you can hold physically, that is more valuable than this idea that you might be able to find or hunt down or whatever that, the roots of that expression is, two birds at some point in the future, right? You might also think about the riddle that kids like, right? Or maybe it's not just kids, but this idea of, would you choose $1 million in your hands today? Or would you take a penny that's going to double every day for the next 30 days? Now, if you choose the $1 million today, you've got the benefit of that bag of money or that deposit into your bank account. You have the satisfaction of instant gratification. But if you're willing to wait the 30 days and you trust that that money actually will double, you'll end up with over $5 million at the end of the experiment, right? You may have heard of the marshmallow experiment, right? This is an experiment that was conducted in the 60s by a Stanford professor, Walter Mischel, where he took a group of children, ages around 4 and 5 years old, and he tested them. He put them in a room with a single marshmallow and said, okay, you're going to be in this room alone with a marshmallow for 15 minutes. Now, if you can sit through this period of time without eating the marshmallow, at the end of that 15 minutes, you're going to get another marshmallow. So there was a reward for delaying the gratification of eating a marshmallow. And what they found, which was really interesting in this study, was that for the children who were able to delay eating the marshmallow, right? The ones who were able to sit through the 15 minutes of discomfort of not eating the marshmallow, they went on to overall have more successful lives, right? They did this study over a period of about 40 years, as I understand it. And what they found was that those children who were able to delay gratification had higher SAT scores. They were less likely to have drug abuse problems, obesity. They generally had better resilience. They had better relationships. And so the skill of being able to delay gratification, to be able to favor that thing in the future versus the thing that you have today, is one that will lead to greater success. Now, when we talk about the marshmallow experiment, that might seem really obvious to you, right? When I hear that experiment about the marshmallows, I'm like, well, of course, I don't even like marshmallows. So you could sit me in a room for 2 hours with a marshmallow, and if it meant I got 20,000 marshmallows, great, because I don't like them. But there are things that will happen in your day-to-day that are the equivalent, right? It's like these hidden marshmallows where you are maybe just out of lack of awareness or not really thinking about it, where you eat that marshmallow, right? And you miss out on the opportunity for the greater marshmallows. So when we think about procrastination, right, this is another way of thinking about procrastination, is that it's kind of like the opposite of delayed gratification. So if you put off a task today, right, that is boring or unpleasant, going back to that definition that Cambridge offered, basically what you're doing is you are choosing the instant gratification, right? You're choosing to eat that one marshmallow in exchange for the greater reward that comes later. So if you choose to push off doing your timesheets, what you get in exchange is the relief of not having to do them in the moment, right? You can free up your time. You don't have to think about it. You can go off and live your day. You don't have to sit through the tedious work of actually doing them. But the cost to you then, right, that delayed gratification, is that the work is not done, right? You then have to do that work at some point in the future. So you might think about, for you, yes, maybe marshmallows are obvious. You're in a test situation. You know the right decision to make. But this might be presenting in subtle ways that maybe you're not thinking about in terms of that marshmallow context, where there is a clear benefit to delaying the gratification. So what can happen then is if you are choosing that one marshmallow, the present day marshmallow, in the moment you're having a party, right? You're feeling great, you're eating the marshmallow, but the future self, your future self, still needs to do the work, and they are not getting any additional marshmallows. So the lesson here, right? Going back to myth number 1, right? The idea that your future self is a woo-woo concept. We really shouldn't be talking about her. We don't need to take her opinions into account. The lesson here is that your future self is very real. Her opinion matters, And as humans, we are somehow biased in favor of the present moment over that some point in the future, right? But the reality is that you today are the product of your past self, right? You are today the future self of your yesterday self, your 5 minutes ago self, right? Even the fact that you chose to listen to this episode, that was a decision of your past self. You are now your future self, learning about your future self. It's all very meta. But when you look around, right, at the work that you do, the files that you have, the colleagues that you have, the relationships that you have, your family, your children, if you have them, the home that you live in, the way that you set up your office, all of these things that surround you are the result of decisions that you have made in the past. They are the results of beliefs that you carry. They're results of actions that you have taken or not taken. And so we want to bring future self, however you want to describe that, into the forefront because we really want to start thinking about her and we want to start taking into account her opinion and how we're going to set her up for success in the future. So, myth number 2 is that it will be easier for your future self to do it. So this is where I was at the other day when I was looking at my invoices thinking, you know what, it'll be so much easier to do those invoices tomorrow. I really should just put that off. Not true, right? When you put things off, there is very likely a part of you that consciously or unconsciously has this belief that it's going to be easier for you to do whatever task it is at some point in the future. So where do I see this show up consciously? When I have conversations with lawyers who are thinking about their job, and they might tell me that they really dislike their job, but they have a lot on their plates right now. And so, you know what? It's going to be easier for me to think about this in 6 months' time because when the 6 months wraps up, I will have resolved or all these files that I've got on my desk right now, this court hearing that I have, that will be behind me. And so it's going to be a much better time for me to decide about whether or not I'm going to stay in my job or do some other thing. And the reality is, and I'm sure you're thinking it already, is that it's not true, right? In 6 months' time, you'll be busy with other files, right? Other circumstances might also make it more difficult to think about making a move at that time, right? Maybe it'll be summertime and it's not necessarily a great time to make a transition, or you're going to be on summer vacation, or maybe it's bonus period and you don't want to leave before you receive your bonus. And if you do that long enough, right? If you go through multiple cycles and years where you keep pushing things off, it might get harder for you to make a move, right? You might miss the window, if there is a window for that peak period to transition your career or what that might be. Now, I would question whether that's actually true, whether, there are always opportunities. But that being said, this idea that it's going to somehow be easier in the future, very likely is not even true. So that's a conscious telling yourself that it'll be easier for your future self to do it at some point in the future. Now, unconsciously, you might also be thinking this as well, or believing that on some level, it'll be easier for your future self. So going back to timesheets, for example, let's say it's the end of the day. You've been at the office for hours and hours and hours. Maybe you've been there for 10 hours and you go to do your timesheet and you realize that you've had one of those really choppy days with lots of interruptions, lots of non-billable. Maybe you had a lunch date or some training that you were attending, and you go to do your timesheets and you realize that instead of the number of hours that you were hoping to be able to record, right? The number of hours that would put you on track for target or help you catch up with any billable deficit that you're at currently, instead of being in that position, you realize that you've got a very low number of hours, right? You've got like a 1.1 or a 3.2 or whatever would feel low to you in the moment. And so you think about doing the act of recording your time, but then you start to feel that sense of shame that you didn't, have more hours to bill. You might start feeling frustrated that you've been at the office all day and yet you have nothing to show for it. You might feel embarrassed that you haven't been able to find the work or organize yourself to do the work. You might find that you feel really annoyed with yourself that this is happening yet again. And so instead of dealing with the feeling of frustration and doing whatever it is that you need to do to record that time, you decide you're just not going to do it today. You're going to do it at some point in the future. Now, sometimes the opposite would be true, right? Maybe you reach the end of the day and instead of it being not enough hours that you're recording, you have too many hours that you're recording. So maybe you have spent 10 hours actively working on a task that you think should have taken you 5 hours. And so instead of feeling maybe that shame that you don't have enough hours, you're feeling the shame that it's taken you so long, right? The lawyer down the hall, they would have done it in half the time. Or maybe you've got a really cost-sensitive client, right? A client who is maybe an individual, they don't have a ton of money. And yes, what you're doing is in line with the mandate. This is not work that will come as a surprise. You've already had a conversation with them about the nature of the work, but you feel guilty and resistant about recording the time on the timesheet. And so instead of doing that, you push off the task, telling yourself, you know what, I'm just going to have to do it later. So on some unconscious level, right, you think, well, it's going to be easier to do this task, not today, but at some point in the future. As I'm going through this example, I'm sure you can already guess where I'm going next because you've probably done this before. And the answer, of course, is, will that task get easier? And the answer, of course, is no, right? It's not going to become easier for you to record the time later. The emotions that you feel around the time, they may change, but chances are they're not going to change, right? You might be fresher or have more energy, but chances are you're still going to feel dread and discomfort as you go to record the time. It might even become more difficult, right? If you find that your recollection of the work that you did has faded, it might be even harder for you to quantify maybe the amount of time you spent and also the nature of the work that you were doing during that time. And in many cases, the task actually becomes more difficult, right? So instead of the task of recording your time getting easier, right, as your recollection fades, it gets more challenging. And there are a number of examples where this would also be true, right? So if you think about a project that you have where it's a complicated project and you really feel like you don't want to get started, right? It feels overwhelming. There's so many pieces. You don't even know where to begin. Maybe it's drafting something where you feel, I've worked with lawyers who really dread the task of drafting court submissions because they feel like they need to be perfect. And so when they sit down to do it, they're already imagining how someone's going to tear this argument to shreds. And so instead of getting started on the project, they just keep pushing it off. And so the result of that, though, is that it doesn't get easier. Instead, you end up with less time to do the work and you end up rushing sometimes to get the work completed. Sometimes it becomes more difficult, right, to do because you don't have enough time to gather the information that you need or to set yourself up in a way that you can do this in a spacious manner. And so it's easy to see, for example, I know when I used to practice, sometimes clients would come to me or my firm and they'd have these lawsuits that they wanted to file. And instead of giving us time to prepare, they would bring the file to us days before the limitation period was about to wrap up. And, maybe the thinking there is, well, if I give my lawyer only a certain amount of time to do the task, they'll do it faster and therefore cheaper. And maybe that's true. But what I found more often than not was that when things were put off till the last minute, it wasn't cheaper because chances are you're doing things in more of an emergency mode. And so it's not necessarily saving time or money. And often it's done in a more rushed way, right? Because you're having to scramble because the timeline is so imminent and you don't always get the same quality of work product, right? If you have more time, you can seek out more information, right? You can delegate tasks if you need to have people do it in a more efficient manner. So it's very easy to see when it is somebody else who maybe is giving you that shortened deadline. It might be harder to see when it's you giving yourself that shortened deadline. So what I'm trying to get at here is in the moment, right? You are looking at that task and you're thinking, okay, I'm just going to put it off. It'll be easier to do tomorrow. And the reality is it's not necessarily, and it's very unlikely that it will be easier. So again, going back to my example from the other day, I sat down with my list of invoices that I needed to send. And if I were to, on some level, I thought, well, it'll just be better. It'll just be better to do it at some point in the future. But the reality is I knew it was not going to be better, right? I know for myself, when I schedule my days, I leave my admin to mid-afternoon. I know that the mid-afternoon is probably the worst time for me to do my admin. And so I knew that given the week that I have, it's not like I'm going to feel like doing it. It's just going to be doing it at a different time and feeling just as dreadful. And so for you, you might think about that as well. It also makes me think of an example of a lawyer that I worked with recently who had the experience of having some sweaty experiences with her team where they were filing certain court materials. And it was just this, and maybe you've been there. I know I have, right? Where everything is kind of coming in at the last minute. You're having to put together all your records, you're having to file them. And because you're doing it in such a rush, it just feels more stressful than it needs to be. You're wondering, did we file everything? Did we get all the pages in there that we needed to? I don't know if you're still photocopying, but when I used to practice, we would photocopy everything. So did all the copies come through? Are there any missing pages, etc.? So with a court filing deadline, chances are you've got notice, right? You know in advance when you need to file things, what the deadlines are. And so if you can always work your way backwards and have the process be one where you and your team build in extra time so that next time you go to make your filing submissions, you're not scrambling at the end. So this lawyer in particular went about having a meeting with her team so that they could then figure out more productive ways to plan and to file so that they weren't having these really rushed and stressful timelines. She made a conscious choice that she did not want to put her future self or the future selves of her team through this unnecessarily stressful process. So as we think about that, right, as you think about cases where you might think, okay, well, I'll just do that tomorrow. It'll be just as easy or it'll be easier. Then you want to bear that in mind. Is that really the case? Will you feel like doing it tomorrow? Chances are it's not going to be any different. So the lesson, tasks do not become easier or more pleasant for your future self, and they often become more difficult. So that was myth number 2. So myth number 3. Your future self is cool with procrastination. She always finds a way to get it done, right? So going back to point 1, this idea that your future self is a little bit of an abstract concept. Because of that, you may find that you don't treat you in the future, your future self, with the care and the respect that you deserve. So a couple of analogies here that came to mind for me. Number 1 is parents, right? Our parents love us unconditionally, right? And so we know that no matter what, they are our parents. They can't really change that. And in some cases, not all parents are like this, but in some cases that means that maybe you can get away with some bad behavior because you know that your parents aren't going to disown you for, minor transgressions or whatever it is. And much like your parents are your parents, your future self is kind of stuck with you, right? No matter what you do, as long as you have the privilege of being here on this planet, your future self, she's kind of stuck with you. And so you can get away with bad behavior and she really doesn't have a choice, right? She is you. And so that's one reason why you might find that, you're kind of dumping things on her that you might not do with other people. Another reason is, or analogy that came to mind is thinking about celebrities, right? When you see somebody in the public eye, whether it's a celebrity or a politician or someone who just seems kind of famous, it can bring about this feeling like that person isn't actually real. And so you might think it's okay to say things about them that are hurtful or things that you would never say about someone who you actually know in your real life or somebody who you interact with on the day-to-day. They don't feel like a real person. And sometimes your future self can have that same feeling, right? Because we can't really see that person. We can't see into the future. We do things today that, we don't really appreciate the full consequences because it's such an abstract concept. Now, a third example that also came into mind is the idea of sometimes when you work with really senior lawyers. Now, this will be different depending on the stage of practice that you're at. But when you're quite junior in particular, you might see future senior lawyers as being omniscient, right? That they must know the answer to everything. And they do know a lot of answers and they do have the benefit of experience and wisdom and they've seen things happen before. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the answer is clear to them. And so you might find that, you might have a tough question on your plate. I see this a lot actually, where a senior lawyer would assign a research question to a junior lawyer, and the junior lawyer would not answer the question. And it was very frustrating for the senior lawyer because they would eventually have to answer that question for themselves. And so in a way, I think there's this disconnect, right, between the junior lawyer thinking that the senior lawyer must somehow be really different, right? Because they're so senior, right? It's almost like this abstract, not really understanding where that senior lawyer is coming from, but that senior lawyer still needs to come up with an answer, right? And if the junior lawyer doesn't come up with the answer, the senior lawyer still has to do the work. So these are some analogies that kind of get to the point that I'm trying to make here, which is that sometimes we just assume that it's cool for that person, right? That, they don't mind, they're going to deal with it. They come through every single time. They're not real, or, you feel that distance, they're stuck with you. And so what I'm getting at here is that your future self probably isn't cool with the fact that you are procrastinating and creating a bucket of tasks for her that she ultimately doesn't really want to do. And so what we want to start thinking about is how we can start setting boundaries and setting those boundaries for your future. And what you might think about is bringing it to a more tangible example. So if you think about some of the things that you might be delegating to your future self, you can ask yourself, would you delegate to any other human being on the planet the tasks that you are delegating to yourself in the future? So those tasks might include all the admin that you're procrastinating and pushing off. It might be a huge project where you just keep putting it off. And so you know that that deadline is getting more imminent, but you're not really doing anything about it. So at some point in the future, that's going to be you, right? You're going to be in the office till 2 a.m., 3 a.m. doing work that maybe you could have done earlier. You might leave her stuck, right? Going back to this idea of procrastinating in a job, right? You might be confining your future self to be doing this in a job that she may not even like, right? Yet you are refusing to do something about it. And so that future self then, she's got the admin, she's got the project, she's in a job that she doesn't like. Not only that, but she's also cleaning up all the messes that you have sort of handed over to her. So she doesn't really have a chance to make any future focused decisions of her own, right? As a result, you might find that she becomes resentful, right? She feels overcommitted to projects that you, right? Maybe those are projects you didn't want to do in the moment, but you assume she'd be okay with it at some point in the future, right? You might think about what types of projects you're taking on, right? Is it something that she is going to want to do? I've had this come up in social situations, right? Where it's like you commit to doing something in the future, right? And then you're in that commitment and you think, well, it's this other person's fault that I'm here, right? It's this other person's fault that I've committed to this particular thing. And really, it's just you committing yourself in the future to something that you know that you don't want to do, right? If you, for example, schedule a networking event on an evening where you've been in court all day, maybe that would be energizing for you. Or maybe you know that after a full day in court, you're going to be exhausted. And so you might go to that event and feel like, oh, this is such a drain. I can't believe that, I have to be here, etc. But really, it's a choice that you made in the past that is influencing your future self. So you might just want to make a different decision in the moment. Your future self might feel exhausted, right? She has too much on her plate and not enough time to do it. You might find that the future self also, her work is more difficult than it needs to be, right? If you are not given enough time to do a project, you don't have enough time to be able to delegate components of that project and ask for help. You might not have time to get the information that you need to adequately figure out the solution or to adequately do the work. Your memory may have faded. And so maybe a project that would be easy to do in week 1 becomes really difficult to do in week 3 because you've forgotten the detail. And also the project then becomes increasingly urgent, right? So you're not creating optimal work conditions to create a good product. It really is getting worse as time progresses. And as I mentioned a moment ago, someone who's operating in those conditions, right? They've got too much on their plate. It's become more challenging as a result of delay. that person is really in reactive mode, right? They are scrambling to survive, and that person is unable to then plan more proactively for her future. So the lesson here is that your future self is not actually all that cool with procrastination, right? Yes, maybe she is going to find a way to get everything done. She has in the past, she will do it again in the future, but there is a cost to that, right? There is a cost in that the work is harder. There's a lot of difficult feelings that go along with that, the resentment, the stress, the overwhelm, and the lack of time then to plan more proactively in the future. So we've talked about these 3 myths, right? Myth number 1, your future self is a woo-woo concept. We don't need to take her opinion into account. And in fact, your future self is very real, right? You are currently the future self of your yesterday's self. Everything around you is a result of previous decisions and beliefs and actions that you've taken or not taken. And so we want to be very conscientious about planning for her. As I mentioned as well, it is inherently more difficult for us as humans to really conceive of the future, right? It's that abstract concept, right? And so there's going to be a bias toward picking the thing today instead of looking at what we might do to benefit ourselves in the future, right? So we want to think about those marshmallows and how we want to delay gratification in certain cases. I mean, sometimes maybe you do want to have that instant gratification. You can make that choice consciously, but we want to be thinking about what are the marshmallows, right? Where are we choosing to do something today that's actually going to not benefit us in the long run? So that was myth number 1. Your future self is woo-woo. We don't need to worry about her. Myth number 2, this is the idea, and I'm just going to go back to my notes to make sure I've got this exactly right. It will be easier for your future self to do it. This is the idea that somehow the work itself will feel easier. Somehow you will actually want to do the work at some point in the future, or the task, whatever that might be. And the reality is, it's not going to be easier. You're not going to feel magically differently about doing your invoices on a Friday versus a Monday. The task is not going to get easier over time. And in fact, more likely, it's going to get more difficult. And then that 3rd myth is the idea that your future self is cool with this. She doesn't mind. She's going to find a way to get it done. Again, I go back to that parent analogy, the celebrity analogy, the idea that this person out there in the future, she's so hard to imagine, right? She's kind of stuck with you no matter what you do. You know she's going to figure it out. We can depend on her. But the reality is we want to give her a better experience of her life. I mean, this, after all, is you in the future. We want to give you a better experience in your future life. And very likely that means doing some things today, like setting boundaries and not committing yourself to a number of things that you don't want to do in the future. It also means doing things today that you could do today. So those are the 3 topics that we've discussed. And in terms of where we go next, well, next time you are tempted to procrastinate, I would encourage you to think about the marshmallow, right? What is the present marshmallow and the future marshmallow at play? And yes, I realize that marshmallows sound a little bit ridiculous, but hopefully that will help you as a bit of an aid memoir, right? That you'll be thinking about the marshmallow, this ridiculous example that Paula shared with me, but it will help to highlight the decision that is ahead of you, right? So again, going back to timesheets, right? The short-term benefit of putting them off is that you can avoid the task, right? You feel that immediate sense of relief. You get to do something else, right? You can go home early. You can, go onto your computer and do something more interesting. Whatever it happens to be for you, there's a short-term relief, but there's a long-term cost that comes with that, right? It leads to harder work in the long run, right? You're going to have to piece those timesheets together at some point, tighter deadlines, right? Maybe you procrastinate this over the course of the month and you end up at the end of the month where you have to put all of your time in a very short period of time. That is not fun. Yes, I have been there. Luckily, I did not have that as my usual practice, but for you, that might be something that you're experiencing. It is not fun. You'll also have the dread, right, of that undone task hanging over your shoulders, right? Your future self, the you in the next hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 2 days, whatever, is experiencing her life with the pressure, right, and the dread of having to do that task at some point in the future, right? So short-term gain, we get to avoid it. Long-term cost, we have to do it at some point in the future, and we have to dread it all the way from now until we actually do it. Now, you might also think about the boundaries component of it, right? The boundaries angle, right? Let's say somebody invites you to a networking event, right? Going back to the example, the networking event that falls at the end of a day where you know you're going to be really busy at work. You're probably going to be exhausted and you're going to want to go home. So the short-term benefit might be that person who invited you is going to feel really happy because you're not saying no to them, right? So you're sparing that person's feelings in the short run, but in the long run, you've committed yourself to 2, 3, 4 hours of an engagement that you know you really don't want to be at. And who knows what experience you're going to have there, right? Maybe you are going to that event because you're trying to make somebody else happy. But if you show up at that event and you're kind of listless, you're not really engaging, are you truly making that person happy? So anyhow, a couple of examples there. And you might also want to think about not just the short-term benefit of doing something, but also the long-term benefit of doing things in the present moment. So if you think about getting the timesheets done, for example, you would then have, yes, the short-term discomfort of having to reckon with the fact that there is not very much time, in your opinion, on that timesheet. And I say in your opinion because it is subjective, right? What is not a lot of time for you might be a lot of time for somebody else. But there's that discomfort of the time. Maybe it's a lot of time, again, subjective. Maybe it's that discomfort of putting the number on the page or entering the number into the system and just feeling how uncomfortable that is. It might be sitting with the feelings of dread and embarrassment and frustration and whatever uncomfortable feelings you have around those timesheets. So that is the short-term cost, the boredom, the tedious nature of work. So again, going back to the definition offered by the Cambridge Online Dictionary, right? What do we procrastinate? We procrastinate tasks that are, what do they say? Unpleasant or boring. So we're going to take on that short-term cost of doing things that are boring or unpleasant. And then we have the long-term benefit, of course, of feeling proud that we've finished the task, the fact that the project has been completed. We've also freed up our time to do something else in the future that we want to do. So some takeaways that I would offer to you for today's episode is, number one, to be kind to your future self and to do things today that set yourself up for success in the future. She is real, right? Your future self is real, and we want to take excellent care of her. We want to treat her just as well, if not better, than we are treating our best friend, right? We really want to take care of her. If you have kids, you want to take care of your future self at the same level as you're taking care of your children. We also want to capitalize on the present moment, right? If there's information that you have ready to hand today that makes it easier for you to do a task, again, I'm thinking of timesheets and similar tasks like that, do what you can to move the needle forward while that information is fresh in your mind. Another example that comes to mind for me is I will often provide notes to clients that I work with about things that we talk about in our coaching sessions. So I like to do those notes as quickly as I can after my sessions because it gets harder to remember what we talked about. I have handwritten notes, but it gets harder to translate those into a brief email summary. And so the same is likely true for components of your practice, right? Where you have a meeting, you need to do notes. If you can do those meeting notes sooner rather than later, it's going to help you do the task faster as opposed to having to piece it all together at a later point. So capitalize on information in the moment. Another takeaway, try not to let how you feel determine whether or not you take action. So again, going back to this idea that your future self is unlikely to feel differently about a task at hand, right? Something that you dread today, chances are you'll also dread it tomorrow. And one tool that I find really helpful for this is self-talk. And so I will tell myself something like, I can be bored and do it anyways. I can be tired and do it anyways. And that simply is a reminder that we do not have to feel like doing a task in order to complete the task. And then finally, give yourself boundaries from the future. So when it comes to social commitments, when it comes to planning projects, when it comes to things where you're making commitments in the future, I'd encourage you to think about, if you wouldn't want to do something today, right? Whether it's a social commitment, whether it's a project, if you don't see the point, if you don't see the alignment, if you don't see how you would want to do it, think twice before you go ahead and commit yourself to that thing, right? Because chances are your future self isn't going to want to do that thing in the future any more than you're going to want to do it today. So when you apply these ideas, right, when you start prioritizing your future self, right, when you start to think in that manner and to, really stop putting things off, right, when you choose not to procrastinate, when you choose to do the thing in the present in order to really preserve and protect and set your future self up for success, what you'll find is you end up developing a much better relationship with yourself, right? Because you are now looking after yourself, you're looking after your future self. And so that becomes a lot more real. You'll likely find that overall, you feel less reactive, right? You feel less overwhelmed, you feel less exhausted because you're not pushing everything off to that future period where you're now grappling with all these competing deadlines and priorities and things that you've put off, as well as new work coming in, and you'll create a much better future. And so I've offered some ideas here today, a new way perhaps to look at procrastination and the relationship between procrastination and your future self, which hopefully gives you some ideas, right? Hopefully gives you some takeaways that you'll think about next time you're tempted to procrastinate. And I'll also mention that if you listen to this podcast, you likely know I have recorded a number of episodes about time management, including procrastination. And so there is a roadmap of all the episodes I've recorded in the podcast series that talk about time management, including procrastination. And so I'll put a link to that roadmap with today's podcast episode. You'll find it in the show notes. And if you want to go further, if you want to do a deeper dive into procrastination, you'll find some episodes there that can help you with that. So that's what I have for you today. I am so glad you joined me here today. I hope you are thinking about your future self, thinking about how we're going to take really, really good care of her. Hopefully this gives you an extra incentive next time you find yourself about to push off a task. Hopefully it helps you recognize some of the hidden marshmallows in your practice. And with that, I'm going to sign off, wish you a beautiful week, and I look forward to reconnecting again soon. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.